The summer Vera Mossbach turned 62. She began digging trenches across the face of her hill, and nobody in Cotter County could agree on whether she was mourning or simply losing her mind. The trenches ran on contour, each one following the invisible line where the elevation held constant, curving with the hillside, the way a ring follows a finger. They were not deep. They were not straight. They did not drain toward any creek or culvert, and that was the part that made people stop their trucks and stare. Every ditch anyone in Cotter County had ever cut was built to move water away. Vera's were built to hold it still. She had been at this for 3 weeks before word got around, and the word that got around was not kind. The questions people asked each other over coffee and across fence lines all collapsed into a single question that nobody thought worth putting to her directly. Why would anyone do this? Nobody asked. They assumed the answer was grief, and grief they understood, even when it wore strange shapes. Her husband Cleet had died in March, and it was still April, and a widow on a hillside with a mattock was, in the region's long tradition, to be tolerated and pitied and given casseroles, in that order. Vera accepted the casseroles. She ate them cold at the tailgate of her truck at noon and went back to digging. Her dog, a red heeler named Bix, lay in the freshly turned earth at the uphill lip of each new trench and watched her work with the complete and intelligent attention that only a working dog can sustain. He did not pace. He did not bark. He simply watched, and if you happened to drive past slowly enough, you might have noticed that Bix's watchfulness had a quality of recognition in it, as if he understood what the trenches were for even if no one else did. Water has a memory. That was the plain sentence Vera's grandfather had written at the top of a composition book she had found in the back of Cleet's filing cabinet 6 days after the funeral, wedged behind a folder of combine receipts. She had not known the book existed. Cleet had kept it without telling her, which was a thing he would do, a tenderness disguised as practicality. The book was her grandfather Emmerich Voss's, and it was 70 years old, and the first entry was dated 1916 and the last was dated 1949, and across those 33 years, Emmerich had kept a meticulous and eccentric record of where the rain went on the land he farmed, which was the same land Vera now farmed, the same hill, the same clay-heavy soil with its false promises of drainage. Water has a memory, not a metaphor, a hydrological fact dressed in plain language. Emmerich had drawn maps, taken measurements, observed the places where the ground stayed damp 2 weeks after a rain, and the places where it cracked and curled by the 4th day. He had noted which springs ran year-round, and which ran only after a wet spell, and which had run steady in his father's time and had since gone dry. He had written, in his looping German-inflected hand, a plan he never executed because his knees had given out in 1947 and the work required 2 good knees and a long faith in outcomes a man would not live to see rewarded. He had been waiting for a younger pair of knees. He had never imagined they would belong to his granddaughter. The plan was for a system of swales, which is a word for a level trench dug on contour to intercept rainwater and hold it against the hillside long enough for it to sink rather than run. Each swale would feed into the next at a measured interval. The effect over years would be to recharge the groundwater of the entire hill from within, slowly and invisibly, the way a sponge accepts water when you press it rather than when you pour over it. Emmerich had calculated that the springs at the base of the hill had gone dry not because the rain had failed, but because the hillside no longer held the rain long enough to feed them. The forest had been cleared for cropland in his father's time. The roots that once held the soil like a sponge had been broken and plowed under. The water that fell now ran off fast and brown and took the topsoil with it and arrived in the creek 3 miles away as a problem rather than a resource. Emmerich had written, in the plain notation of a man who trusted facts over feelings, 37 swales on contour at 11-foot vertical intervals will restore the subsurface flow. It will take 8 to 12 years. You will not see it happen. You will only see that it has happened. Vera had read those 2 sentences the night she found the book. She had read them again. She had gone to the window and looked at the dark hill, and then she had read them one more time. In the morning, she had taken out her hand level and her measuring tape, and she had begun. County Agent Dale Prewitt drove up in his green extension service truck on a Tuesday in the fourth week. He was a large and genuinely kind man of 43 whose confidence in modern soil science was so total and so sincere that it had become, over the years, indistinguishable from certainty, which is a different thing. He got out of the truck with a cup of coffee and stood at the edge of the most recently completed swale and looked at it for a long time with the considered expression of a man doing his best to understand. Vera was working 50 yards uphill, mattock rising and falling in the steady rhythm she had settled into, Bix beside her on the berm. Dale called up to her, and she stopped and looked down at him. He said the swales were pretty, but he was worried she was tiring herself out on a project that wasn't going to do what she thought it was going to do. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She said, "Going to do exactly what I think." He said that modern soil surveys showed the water table on her hill was fed primarily by lateral flow from the ridge formation to the north, not by surface infiltration, and that swales on this particular formation would fill with sediment within 3 seasons and become, effectively, nothing but decorative terracing. He said he could bring her the survey maps if she would find them helpful. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Bring them, if you want." She went back to digging. He stood there another minute with his coffee, wanting to help, unable to find a door in. He left the survey maps in her mailbox 2 days later with a note that said he was available to talk anytime. She read the maps carefully. The survey data was from 1961. Emmerich's observations were from 1916 to 1949. The survey had been conducted after 2 of the driest decades in the county's recorded history. She filed the maps and went back to digging. The casserole brigade came in waves. Norma Shield arrived in May with a pot of chicken and dumplings and stayed an hour trying to convince Vera that the best thing for grief was not physical exhaustion, but rest, socialization, and consideration of whether the farm might be too large for one woman to manage. Norma said this gently and with genuine love, and the love was the thing that made it hard to hear, because love can carry a wrong idea as easily as a right one and deliver it with more force. Vera thanked her for the dumplings. Norma drove down the hill and told 3 people that Vera was not well and that someone should look into what was happening up there. Pastor Grimes stopped by in June and read aloud from the book of Ecclesiastes about seasons and labor and the acceptance of limits, and Vera stood in the field and listened with her hands on the top of the mattock handle, her chin resting on her hands, and when he finished, she said, "Ecclesiastes is a good book." He seemed unsure whether she was agreeing with him or not. He left. Harlan Goss, who owned the 3,000 acres adjacent to Vera's 400 and who had recently installed a center pivot irrigation system fed by a deep well at a cost of $68,000, came by in July and stood at the fence with his forearms on the top rail and watched Vera work for a full 5 minutes before offering the opinion that she was putting an awful lot of labor into something an old notebook told her to do. He said the word notebook the way a man says the word hearsay. He said if she ever wanted to talk about the irrigation options he'd gotten a good price on, he was happy to sit down with her numbers. She said, "I don't need irrigation." He said, "Not this year, maybe." He smiled the smile of a man who has recently spent $68,000 and needs the world to confirm he was right to do so. He drove back to his 3,000 acres. In September, a young woman named Petra Sieb, who had moved to the county the previous spring to start a market garden and who had spent 6 months watching from the road before she finally stopped, walked up the hill to where Vera was working and asked, without greeting or preamble, whether the swales were on contour or on a grade. Vera looked at her. She said, "On contour." Petra nodded slowly, the way a person nods when a piece of data confirms a hypothesis they have been quietly testing. She asked if there was something she could do. Vera handed her a mattock. Petra was 29 and strong and had studied agroforestry for 2 years at a program in Vermont before returning to the region where she'd grown up, and she had never heard the specific word swale applied to a practical project on working land before. only in books and old extension bulletins she'd found at an estate sale. She asked Vera that evening, sitting at the tailgate, how she had decided on 11-foot vertical intervals. Vera showed her the composition book. Petra read the relevant passages with the careful stillness of a person encountering a mind they respect. She said, "Your grandfather was doing systems thinking before anyone had a word for it." Vera said, "He was doing what the land told him." Petra said, "How long before you see anything?" Vera said, "Emmerich wrote 8 to 12 years. I started in April. You do the math." Petra did the math. She came back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and then most days, working mornings on Vera's hill before going to her own plot in the afternoon. They did not talk much while they worked. That was the right arrangement. Bix moved between them with democratic loyalty, lying at the berms in turn, his amber eyes tracking each mattock stroke with the focus of an animal who has decided that what is happening is important and wants to make sure it comes out right. The Swales multiplied. By the end of Vera's first full year of work, she had completed 19 of the 37 her grandfather had prescribed. By the end of the second year, 29. By the end of the third, all 37, and then Emmerich's supplemental notes, which she had been saving for last, proposed 7 additional half-swales at the upper edge of the woodlot to intercept runoff from the ridge, and so they dug those too, 44 swales in all on 400 acres, each one holding the water that fell on the hill against the hill's own body, pressing it inward the way a hand presses water into a sponge. Nothing announced itself. No spring broke through the soil and ran sparkling and obvious for all to see. The ground in the swales grew lush with volunteer grasses and small sedges that no one had planted. In the third spring, Vera noticed that the soft place at the base of the field, which had been dry since she could remember, held its dampness 2 weeks further into the dry season than it had before. She noted this in a fresh composition book she had started keeping. She noted it with the same plain notation her grandfather had used, because it seemed to her that the right way to honor an ancestor's careful record is to extend it in kind. She did not mention it to anyone. The dampness in the low field was not a result yet. It was a sign. The results would come in their own time, and she would not hurry them with talk. The summers of 1985 and 1986 were dry but not catastrophic, and by 1987, the county had experienced 2 consecutive years of below-average rainfall, and the newspapers had begun running items about aquifer levels, and livestock operators were paying attention. Harlan Goss had expanded his irrigation footprint and drilled a second well. The well cost $40,000 and came in at 400 feet, and the water was hard and mineral-laden, but it was water. His first well, at 320 feet, had begun showing a drop in static water level, and he had brought in a hydrogeologist from the city who charged $300 an hour to tell him the aquifer was under stress. Harlan had nodded at this information and ordered the second well and gone on. He was not a man who changed course easily. His certainty was structural. It had been reinforced over 30 years of generally correct decisions made at large scale, and a man who has been right at large scale for 30 years has usually developed a relationship with certainty that begins to resemble a physical addiction. The idea that a woman with a 70-year-old notebook had done something he had not thought to do was not available to him. He could not make it available. It would have required dismantling too much. In the spring of 1988, the rain simply stopped. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the quiet persistence of an absence that deepens without announcing a turning point. March brought a third of its usual rainfall. April brought half of that. May was nearly dry. The creeks fell to strings of isolated pools. The cattle in the low pastures around the county began to be moved early, before the grass gave out, and the sight of cattle on the move in May was unusual enough to make people uneasy. Old-timers began checking the records from 1953 and 1936. The records were not encouraging. By June, the county emergency management coordinator had scheduled a meeting at the courthouse, and Dale Prewitt had driven to the state capitol twice for consultations about drought assistance programs. The well at the Shield place went dry on the 14th of June. Norma called her husband in from the field. And they stood over the dry opening, and Norma said, in a voice very small for a woman of her customary volume, that she didn't know what they were going to do. The Shield well had run at 40 feet for 60 years. The grain farm's well failed a week later. The well Harlan Goss had drilled in 1982 at 320 feet showed a static level drop of 60 feet by the 1st of July and was producing a quarter of its rated yield. His new 400-foot well held, but his pump was working against a column of water that was shrinking, and the electricity bills for the month of June ran to $1,140. He did not speak of this publicly. The crops in the county's eastern fields began to burn at the edges. The corn that had gone in early was tasseling without enough moisture to fill the ears. The county extension office received 22 calls in a single day asking about emergency water hauling costs. It was Dale Prewitt who first drove up Vera's Hill in early July, not to advise her this time, but to look. He had driven past her fields twice in the previous week and seen something he could not account for with his certainty alone. He needed to come and look directly. What he saw from the fence line at the base of the hill was a field that was not burning. The grass was not as tall as it would have been in a wet year, but it was green, and in the low corner of the field, the soft place Vera had noted in her composition book, a line of willows she had planted in the second year were standing in ground that was visibly moist from 10 feet away. He could see the dark difference in the soil color from where he stood. He stood at that fence for a long time. Then he drove up to the house and knocked. Vera was at the kitchen table with the composition book open and a glass of water at her elbow. She let Dale in and he sat across from her and he did not say anything for a moment, which was unusual for him. Then he said, "The Swales held." She said, "They held." He said, "How wet is it down there by the willows?" She said, "Wet enough." He asked if he could see the composition book. She passed it across the table and he read in silence for several minutes. His coffee sat at his elbow going cold and he didn't touch it. He read Emmerich's original entries, the maps, the calculations, the plain sentence about 8 to 12 years, and Vera's extension of the record in her own handwriting, the notation about the soft place in year 3, the additional measurements she had taken each spring since. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked at her. He said, "I was wrong." She said, "You were going by what you knew." He said, "I was going by a survey from 1961. She said, "Emmerich had 33 years on this specific ground." The survey had one afternoon. He nodded. He was quiet again. There is a particular quality of silence in a genuinely capable person who has made a significant error and is looking at it without flinching, and Dale Prewitt sat in that silence with a dignity that redeemed him somewhat. He said, "People are going to need water." She said, "I know." He said, "Could you share what you have?" She said, "I was going to. That was all." He asked what she would need in return, and she said, "Nothing." He started to say that wasn't right, that she should at least, and she said, "I know what I should do. I'm going to do it. Bring people up." He drove back down the hill and made 6 phone calls. By the 15th of July, Vera had opened the lower pasture fence and allowed 3 neighboring families to graze their cattle on the moist grass that had held through the drought because the soil beneath it was saturated to a depth that the dry season had not yet reached. She asked nothing for it. She charged the Shields and the Grains and the Brenneman family $20 a month per head, which was the cost of Vera's fence maintenance and nothing more, a price so far below the market for emergency water and grazing access that Dale Prewitt actually argued with her about it. She said, "Dale, these are neighbors." He said the going rate for emergency water access was 3 times that. She said, "I'm not going by the going rate." Petra was there for most of this. She had her own plot to manage through the drought, and the half-swales she had begun installing on her own land in the second year of working with Vera were not yet mature enough to have produced the same deep saturation, but they had slowed enough water to keep her market garden alive without irrigation when every other market garden in the county was failing or hauling water at heavy cost. She watched Vera open the fence and move among the desperate and the humbled with a kind of attention that was not warmth exactly, not softness, but something more durable, a steadiness in the presence of suffering that did not require the suffering to be anything other than what it was. No consolation, no explanation, just the fence open and the grass there and the price anyone could afford. Harlan Goss came on the 22nd of July. He did not call ahead. He pulled his truck into the yard and got out, and Vera was at the fence watching a neighbor's Angus cattle moving slow and purposeful through the lower pasture. Harlan stood beside her and watched too, and the silence between them had a different texture than the silence between Vera and Petra, which was the silence of shared understanding. This was the silence of a man who has come to say something that costs him and has not yet found the words. He said, "I owe you an apology." She did not answer immediately. Then she said, "I know." He said, "I was unkind." She said, "You were confident." He thought about whether that was better or worse than unkind and decided it was worse and did not argue the point. He asked, looking at the grass, looking at the dark, wet soil at the base of the willows, how she had known. She said, "My grandfather knew. I just believed him." Harlan was quiet. Then he said, "My second well is holding, but the aquifer is still dropping. I've got a hydrogeologist who says if we don't get meaningful rain by September, we're looking at a serious dewatering event." She said, "I know." He said, "I don't suppose there's anything I can do at this point." She said, "You can learn what the system is." He looked at her. She said, "Come back in a week. I'll show you the book and we can walk the swales and you can see how they're built. I can't do your 400 in a season, but you can start." He said, "Will I see results in time?" She said, "No." He said, "Then why do it?" She said, "Because the land will." He went home. He came back in a week, as she had said, and she walked him through all 44 swales and showed him Emmerich's maps and her own extension of them and explained the 11-foot vertical interval logic and the way each swale fed the next and the cumulative effect on subsurface flow. He listened with a quality of attention she had not seen from him before. He asked precise questions. She answered them precisely. She did not perform graciousness about the changed relationship. She did not make him feel forgiven or unforgiven. She treated him as a person interested in learning how a system works, because that was what he had become, and that was more useful than anything else she could have offered him. The rain returned in October, a long, slow front that brought 4 inches over 10 days, and the crisis dissolved the way most crises do, not all at once but in stages, each stage bringing relief and then the next stage of relief until people began, gradually, to believe they had always known it would be fine. This is a human habit, and Vera did not hold it against anyone. The county recorded the 1988 drought in its emergency management files as the most severe water stress event since 1953, and noted that some private landholders in the eastern portion of the county had experienced less impact than expected due to, as the report put it, unspecified soil management practices. Unspecified was a funny word for what Emmerich Voss had thought through over 33 years in a composition book and what Vera had executed over 4 years with a mattock and a dog and a young woman with strong hands. Dale Prewitt, to his lasting credit, wrote a 20-page bulletin for the county extension office the following winter that described swale systems on contour as a meaningful drought resilience tool for landowners in the clay-heavy soils of the region's hill country. He cited Emmerich's system by name and described the design logic in plain language accessible to any working farmer. He did not present it as a new idea. He presented it accurately as an old idea that had been correctly applied and then ignored and then proven. He sent a copy to the state office, and the state office sent it to the regional office. And 2 years later, a researcher from a land-grant university drove down to walk Vera's swales in person and wrote a paper about subsurface recharge rates in swale-managed hillside systems that was cited in 8 subsequent papers. Vera did not read the papers. Petra read them and told her about them. Vera said, "Emmerich would have found that satisfying." Petra said, "Don't you?" Vera said, "I find it correct." That's enough. Petra bought 20 acres adjacent to Vera's south fence in 1990 and built a house there and spent the next decade completing a swale system on her own land and helping 3 other neighbors design and install theirs. She kept a composition book too, which she had started doing without deciding to, finding that the practice had arrived in her hands the way certain habits do when you have learned them from someone for whom they were constitutive. Vera died in 1999 at 73. She left the farm to a land trust with the provision that it be managed in perpetuity using the swale system documented in the 2 composition books, hers and Emmerich's, which were to be kept together in the farm's records and made available to anyone working the land. The land trust put up a small cedar post at the top of the highest swale with a metal plate on it. On the plate they engraved a sentence from Emmerich's composition book, not the one about 8 to 12 years, though that one was true too, but the one he had written at the bottom of the very last page in 1949, the year his knees gave out, and he set the plan aside for younger hands. The sentence was, "What the ground is given it keeps, and what it keeps it gives back." You could walk up there in any dry July and put your hand in the soil at the bottom of the highest swale and feel the coolness there, the damp held deep against all the heat the season could offer. The hill remembered. It had been taught to remember. That was the whole of it.